Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are with the one and only Yossi Klein Halevi, profound author, fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and really a voice bridging Israel and the diaspora. Welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
You recently wrote an article to Israel's friends, a letter, if I may say, to Israel's friends in the diaspora, saying that now is the time to speak up about the situation in Israel, which is definitely concerning in different ways. And I guess my question to you is based a bit on a story. I don't know if it was 2004, 2006, I was in New York, and there were people organizing protests against the Gaza disengagement in front of the Israeli consulate. Even though I was against the Gaza disengagement, I didn't go because I didn't feel it's the place, my place as someone not living in Israel, to influence Israeli decision-making. Why do you think this time is different?
Well, first of all, I don't think that time was different either. I think that those who felt so strongly that the disengagement would be a mortal blow to Zionism, to Israel, had not just the right, but the responsibility to demonstrate, even if you happen to be living in Teaneck instead of Jerusalem. And I believe that if we take the idea that Israel really belongs to the Jewish people seriously, then that means that we don't only have to put up with diaspora criticism, whether it comes from the left, the right, or the center, but we should be welcoming diaspora criticism. Everything has to be qualified, right? There's diaspora criticism, and then there's relentless, I would almost say, a kind of a viciousness that comes, we've seen it mostly on the left in recent years. And I certainly don't welcome criticism that comes from a place of alienation and even hatred. But criticism that comes from love, from a sense of having a deep stake in the future of Israel, I personally welcome that from whatever side it comes from. And look, Israel belongs to its citizens, first of all. And when I say its citizens, I mean its Jewish citizens and its non-Jewish citizens. Those who vote in elections determine Israeli policy. But Israel functions on two levels. We are the state of all of our citizens, but we're also the state of the Jewish people. And I would say that being the state of the Jewish people is our first identity. The state of all of our citizens is the second identity. And the priorities have to be clear. Israel is a Jewish state, and then it is a democratic state. A close second, but that's the hierarchy of my values, and I think of the values of most Jewish Israelis. What that means then, if we're serious about Israel as the state of the Jewish people, it's not just a slogan. And it's not just we come to the diaspora when we need you. We also have a responsibility to listen to the diaspora. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to express itself. Diaspora concerns don't necessarily have to express themselves in demonstrations outside the Israeli consulate. It can happen behind closed doors. It can happen with American Jewish leaders telling Israeli leaders, our communities are deeply worried about the future of whatever the policy is. And that's, again, that has to be part of the relationship. It's artificial. It's not going to stand to expect this to simply be one way. You in the diaspora shut up, and your only job is to support whatever Israeli government is.
I mean, there are definitely voices like that, more on the Israeli side of the political spectrum of, the diaspora shouldn't have anything to say. But is this a message that you also would push with people like Peter Beinart, Jeremy Ben-Ami, Thomas Friedman, who feel like they're doing exactly what you're saying?
I make a distinction between the first name you mentioned and Friedman and who is
Jeremy Ben-Ami of J Street, Peter Beinart, and even if not now.
anyone, if not now, is again belongs to the Beinart camp. The line for me, and it's an important line, and not everyone makes that distinction, either on the left or the right. And that distinction is, do you accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state? J Street says they do, if not now, says they don't. Or they're neutral on the issue. I'm sorry, there's no neutral on issues on Israel as a Jewish state. Friedman accepts Israel's right to define itself as a Jewish state. Beinart does not. They don't belong in the same camp. And the dividing line for me is are you ready to accept Israel's legitimacy as a Jewish state? And I don't think that the right does us any favors by obscuring that line. That should be a bright red line. And anyone who is in principle for a Jewish state, I may not like their politics. I find myself far more in disagreement with J Street than I do in agreement. But they're inside my tent. I wouldn't put them out of the tent. I was vehemently against J Street's position on Iran. I spent months working with AIPAC, writing, trying to stop the JCPOA, and J Street was, to my mind, very much on the wrong side of that issue. But afterwards, okay, we're still in conversation, and there's something deeply disturbing about the ease with which some Jews are prepared to exclude whole parts of the Jewish people with whom they disagree.
You know what? The way I phrase it is, how many Jews do you have to be against in your own Jewish people to be called an anti-Semite yourself? I mean, what's the number? Because there are people, this guy's terrible, this Jew is an anti-Semite, that Jew is an anti-Semite, and then you ask, at what point are you an anti-Semite, since you've been calling the rest of us that?
Elchanan, it's when we talk about Ahavat Yisrael, what do we mean? Do we mean love of the Jewish people indiscriminately, or do we mean I love those Jewish people who look like me? When I look in the mirror, I see them. That's not Ahavat Yisrael. That's Ahava Atzmit. That's self-love. Ahavat Yisrael, the great test for Ahavat Yisrael is, what do I do with those Jews with whom I passionately disagree? Now, as an Israeli, I have a very long list of Jews, whole communities, whole ideologies with whom I deeply disagree. But my test of Ahavat Yisrael is how I relate to them, not how I relate to those in my own camp. So I think that we really need to reaffirm Ahavat Yisrael in its deepest and broadest sense.
And so what is it that you would say to Jews in the diaspora? What's your message? What should they be doing? And by the way, I'll just fill you in. I try as much as I can to leave Israeli politics to Israelis. I was sitting on Shabbat with someone who's been a Likud, diaspora Likud member for 30 years and is very big in the financial world. And I said, there's this warning from JP Morgan, also New York, saying that Israel's economy will crash. Is it real? And he said it is 100% real. So at this point, I think you're right that, anyone who cares about Israel and not wanting to see it completely economically implode, this is a good time. But what would be the message?
And socially implode. We are on the verge, God forbid, of an explosion that we haven't experienced since the months before the Rabin assassination, through the Oslo process. And for me, this is the right's equivalent of the Oslo process. The Oslo process was forced on the right by the left in an anti-democratic way. The left manipulated a very artificial parliamentary majority through bribes and other means, and now what I see happening with the right is that they're doing something similar. Now, it's true this government was democratically elected. It had its legitimate majority, but it was not elected, despite what Netanyahu claims now, to impose this far-reaching judicial agenda. At no time did Netanyahu or anyone else in his party present the plan to the Israeli public. No one told the public, this is what we're going to do a month after we come into power. They obviously had this plan all laid out.
Mm-hmm. And just if you can outline for the ignorant among us, what the plan, briefly speaking, how would it alter Israeli democracy?
The plan would grant an override to the Knesset with a simple parliamentary majority for any Supreme Court decision. Now, supporters of the government say Canada has an override and there are other countries that have overrides. Yes, that's true. And there does need to be some parliamentary override in Israel. Judicial activism in Israel went too far. There needs to be reform, but reform is not revolution. And what this government is proposing is a revolution without the built-in checks and balances that exist in Canada, in the US, in England. So when the government supporters point to the American system and say, look, the president appoints judges or Supreme Court judges. Why shouldn't we in Israel have the same system? Yes, but in the US, you have a constitution. You have two houses of two legislative houses.
You have states.
There's states' rights. There's a developed system. The only counterbalance to unlimited power on the part of the prime minister is the Supreme Court. If you give the prime minister, who controls parliament, because we only have one house, he controls parliament. If you give him all of the power over the Supreme Court, he controls all three branches of government. Where's the checks and balances? How do you compare that to any other democracy? And so I listened to the defenders of this plan, and I said, a little bit of honesty, some straight talk here. Don't try to sell us on comparisons that are not relevant to the Israeli situation. Let's talk about serious judicial reform. Let's talk about reining in the powers of the Supreme Court. I'm with you, but up to a point, not to the point, not past the point where you start emptying out the court of any significant ability to counter the power of the prime minister.
Mm-hmm. And that's an excellent point. What would you like, though, to see American Jews doing? So, of course, we know they've been concerned. We know that also the Israeli Jewish community and the American Jewish community are not always on the same wavelength. What would you like to see Jews doing? Obviously, you wouldn't want them to say, okay, otherwise we don't support the state of Israel.
No, of course not. And God forbid to threaten boycotts. That's not how Jews should be speaking to each other under almost any circumstances. Boycotts lead to schism, irreparable schism. If I'm boycotting whole groups of the Jewish people, then I'm heading toward the creation of two peoples, two separate peoples. God forbid. What I would like to see, first of all, are diaspora Jews taking seriously what's happening in Israel. Read both sides, get to listen to both sides. Whatever your ideological position is, be open to the other camp. Become knowledgeable about the position that you disagree with. And I think that's a rule of thumb generally in how Jews should be relating to each other. We need to understand the other's arguments. I know my arguments. I'm not interested in just hearing and reading my arguments. And so that's first of all. Secondly, if you come to the conclusion, as so many of us in Israel have, that this is a critical moment for the future of Israeli democracy, Israeli society, the Israeli economy, then American Jews need to think among themselves, what do you do? And what I would like to see is, first of all, when American Jewish leaders meet with Israeli government ministers behind closed doors, those meetings should not be polite.
Are they?
American
But are they ever?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Israeli ministers throw around slogans about Jewish solidarity and your support for Israel, and yes, they're far more polite than they should be at this moment. And I would like to see American Jewish leaders deliver the message that their constituents are extremely concerned about where this government is taking us. Let me say a word about this government. Not only is it proposing the most far-reaching judicial changes that any government in Israel, in the history of Israel, has ever proposed, but this is a government headed by a prime minister who's on trial for 3 counts of corruption. Now, innocent until proven guilty. But how do you give this prime minister the right to transform the legal system to the point where he is then going to be able to, in potential, appoint the judges who may be sitting on his case? What is this? Is this judicial reform? To my mind, it's a collapse of any serious norms of restraint, of respect for democratic procedure.
Finally, because I know you're tight on time, a question about this relationship between Israel and the diaspora. What is Israel's responsibility to diaspora Jews? I've spoken recently a lot about the fact that Israel's campaign for Aliyah in the general Jewish community is not great. We've heard Ron Dermer's very, devastating words. I call it the Dermer doctrine of swapping American Jews for evangelicals. In what sense is Israel responsible for diaspora Jews, and do Israelis see any kind of responsibility, especially now that they're becoming the largest Jewish community in the world?
Look, if we are, again, serious about Israel as a Jewish state, as the state of the Jewish people, then you can't exchange parts of the Jewish people for the evangelicals. The evangelicals, and I appreciate their support. I'm deeply grateful for their support.
But many, myself including, would say that the Dermer doctrine has been to exchange American Jews for...
Yes, and to my mind, that's an anti-Zionist doctrine. If Zionism is the embrace of the Jewish people, unconditionally, there are 14 million of us. We have a very good expression in Hebrew, zemayesh. That's what is. I'm stuck with parts of the Jewish people whose ideology, whose the way they practice express their Judaism, their Israeliness, drives me crazy. That's true for all of us. So we have one of two options. We're either going to write off whole parts of the Jewish people, and that seems to be where many of us are heading. God forbid, but I think that is where a large part of the Jewish people is heading, is writing each other out of the story. You're not real Jews. You're not good Jews. I prefer the evangelicals. Or we say, okay, I'm stuck with 14 million Jews. That's what I've got. And I'm going to hold on for dear life to every one of them as hard as I can. Those who drift away, those who turn against Israel, who turn against the Jewish people, what can I do? Okay, but I'm not giving up from my end. I'm not giving up any Jew.
Thank you. A bit of a personal question. I know you don't speak for all Anglo-Jews in Israel. This is my impression. French Jews in Israel elect Knesset members and lobby for Jews in France. Russian and Ukrainian Jews in Israel push heavily for the rights of Olim from the former Soviet Union. Anglos in Israel, my impression, are not fans of their brethren that they left behind. Is that true or possible? Is that a right impression?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I am, and I've been intimately involved with the community that raised me and which I left 40 years ago, but didn't leave behind. I'm one of those Israelis who's constantly on the Ben Gurion JFK line, and I've been writing for the community in which I grew up. I've been writing about Israel for 40 years for American Jews. I've been lecturing all these years. And this community has been very good to me. And I think that it is one of the underappreciated resources that the Jewish people have. We often take American Jewry for granted.
Is that a true impression, though? You see the Ethiopian minister, Penina Tamano-Shata, worked a great deal on bringing Ethiopian Jews. Everyone's advocating for their community, and yet sometimes when I advocate for more Aliyah, during COVID, when things were closed up, it sometimes seems like the American Jews are actually happy to not let their former liberal neighbors into the country.
Well, it's interesting because I think that we're as small an Aliyah, as small as a community as we are, we're extremely diverse, diverse politically as well, and religiously. And Americans tend to be anarchic, we tend to be extreme individualists. And maybe that's part of the reason. We also find our own frameworks with which to express our Israeli commitments that are not in an American Israeli framework. One interesting exception really is Nefesh B'Nefesh, which is, I think, the most successful immigrant absorption organization that any community of Olim have created. And that's an American creation that we can be proud of.
All right, Yossi Klein Halevi, you are a great voice and an extraordinary bridge, bringing together many different groups, but also Israel and the diaspora. Thank you for your good work, and really keep it up. Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.